Welcome back to Second Breakfast and our ongoing chapter-by-chapter coverage of A Game of Thrones. Today's chapter is Daenerys number 4, which marks our 4th Targaryen Checkpoint. This is a theory we developed a long time ago now, that the Dany chapters almost act as preludes. They kind of wrap up a section of the book, and they have little hints or previews, omens, and prophecies about what is to come. So we're going to be squinting extra hard at this chapter, and there's a lot to play with here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this one. It's been, a hot minute since we've seen Dany, and it's always, her chapters are just so different from everybody else's, not only because she's in a different place with different characters, but they just have a different flavor to them, and they're always fun to unpack, so I'm excited to talk about it.
I can't believe how enriched my understanding of this series has been by the episodes we've done on Fire and Blood.
Yeah.
Those are over on our Patreon. We've done 11 volumes, chapter by chapter, working through that book because of House of the Dragon. It's the source material for that series. But there's so much more world building and history and almost geography and time and space in that zoomed out view of Westeros, that when one of the handmaidens in this chapter was from Lys. We just talked about a chapter called, one of these eras of history is called the Lysine Spring.
Yeah.
And I was trying to identify with the Lysine people, and I learned about some of their history and customs in Fire and Blood. So when this character was from Lys, I felt this like jolt through the book.
Yes.
Of, it's actually coming to life here.
I know. It has really enriched my whole experience of this. And even in this chapter, I was looking up a map. Because we get maps of Westeros at the beginning of each of these books, but there aren't any maps of the stuff east of the Narrow Sea. But there are plenty of maps of those online. So I was looking one up online to be like, okay, where actually are they? Like, where is Vice Dothrak? It is way east, Cam. Like, much more east than you would think. Because in your head, you're like, oh, they just have to cross the Narrow Sea. But, like, they're, like, in the middle of, like, it looks like a Russia-sized landmass. Like, they've got a long way to go if they're going to get anywhere close to Westeros. So they're incredibly removed with lots of, like, free cities and other things in between them. So that was really interesting to look at.
And you're traveling by horse.
Yeah.
Or walking in Viserys' case.
Yeah, right.
So what happens in this chapter?
Well,
Megan?
let me tell you. I hope it goes without saying. Quick spoiler reminder for everything in the books and show and beyond.
Shows plural.
Yeah, shows, exactly. So Daenerys, chapter 4 from A Game of Thrones, she has arrived at Vice Dothrak with her Khalasar, with Jorah, with Viserys. They've all finally arrived at this important city for the Dothraki. And we learned that, when we last saw, Viserys had disrespected Dany, and he had been forced to walk on foot, which is like this huge sign of disrespect in Dothraki culture. But we learned that Dany eventually convinced Drogo to let Viserys first ride in the cart, which Viserys did not understand is also a mark of disrespect, because that's with like the cripples and the women who were giving birth and eunuchs, all the people who I guess don't matter to them. But
it's a fun culture, isn't it?
It sure is.
Sure.
But eventually she convinced Drogo to let him ride at the head of the group with him again. She is really advocating for her brother here, as she does throughout most of the chapter. It's really just like a sad, it's clear like abusive relationship content. Like she is just, she loves him and wants him to be okay, even though he treats her terribly. But they've arrived at this city, and as they're walking through, they pass through this sort of like pre-city spot where it's like these ruins of monuments and buildings and like treasures from other lands before they get to this city proper. And it all looks really cool. It's all like stuff that from places that the Dothraki have conquered. It's basically their British museum. Viserys calls it the trash of dead cities, and he continues to complain about the Dothraki. He's impatient that he doesn't have his army yet. He keeps calling them savages. He's just being his nasty self. But eventually he goes off. Literally, he's distracted because there's a statue of a woman with 6 boobs, and he's like, I'm going to go look at that.
I need to go investigate this.
He's got to investigate. And so that leaves Jorah and Dany to speak privately. And Jorah says that he thinks Viserys is not strong enough to take the 7 kingdoms. And then Dany asks, well, if there was someone stronger, could they do it with the Dothraki army? And Jorah says, he thinks about it and he says, well, maybe. He says that in order for the Dothraki to win, it would require like open battle, like not sieges. They're not going to like capture castles. Like that's not where the Dothraki strength lies. Their strength is on the battlefield. And he says that if King Robert is rash enough to pursue like open battle with the Dothraki would probably win. And he thinks Robert is rash enough to do that, but the people around him, his advisors, would not advise that. So that's where the challenge lies. But they finally get to the city proper, and it's massive. And again, it is constructed of buildings from all these different cultures, because the Dothraki themselves don't build. Instead, they had slaves from the places they had conquered build these structures. And so it's this sort of like almost melting pot vibe of a city, but there's hardly anybody there because it is big enough to accommodate all of the Khalasars at once if they were all to come and unite under this like mother of mountains. And the crones of the Dosh Khaleen, which is this like order of religious figures, they're all women, they have prophesied that this one day will happen. So they're in this city. And Drogo says he's going to go up to the Mother of Mountains to make a sacrifice. So Dany has the night off, basically. And so she decides to prepare a nice dinner for Viserys. She's also had some gifts made for him. Like, she's really trying to like olive branch it and get Viserys to try to assimilate into Dothraki culture a bit better so they'll respect him more. So she made him like Dothraki style clothes and stuff. I mean, she didn't make them. She had them made, whatever. And so she asks Dorea, one of her handmaids, to go invite Viserys. But this backfires because Dorea says that Dany commands that Viserys come to dinner. And of course he hates that. And so they get into this big argument and Dany tries to diffuse the situation. She's like, but look, I got you these gifts. Like, look, here you go. And he hates the gifts. He calls them Dothraki rags. And then he says, next, you're going to tell me to wear a braid. And then Dany, maybe not so wisely, says, you have no right to a braid. You haven't won any battles. And then he like grabs her arm and is going to hurt her. And she, in response, grabs the belt that she had made for him and she strikes him across the face, which like cuts his face open. And he can't really fight back in the company of the people around them. And so he's furious, calls her nasty names and leaves. And so then Dany is no longer hungry. So she gives her dinner to her handmaids and to Jorah. And she asks for one of her dragon eggs. The dragon egg comforts her. It makes her feel stronger. And so she kind of falls asleep holding the dragon egg. She feels her baby kicking inside of her and she calls him the true dragon, and she falls asleep dreaming of home. And that's where we leave it. So really, like, we get a lot of Dothraki history and culture, and like we learn about that. We also get a lot of important, I think, character moments about Dany and Viserys, but also Jorah, and also like King Robert and Ned Stark, oddly enough. Like, there's a lot of connective tissue in this chapter, which was really fun to see.
And it strengthens that argument of these Targaryen checkpoints. But let's start with Viserys, because
let's do it.
You said that it wasn't wise for her to bitch slap him with that point about the ponytail. I think it was the wisest thing she did this chapter.
Okay.
Because she does seem to be, I mean, in this chapter alone, we don't get that many Dany chapters in the first book. She's outgrowing him here.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Like it's a good moment for her. It's not wise in that it means that he doesn't react well, but you're right. I mean, it's good that she's fighting back.
And because we are so much on Dany's side, the second that she outgrows Viserys, we look at him in this totally new light. I mean, we've already hated him, but now he seems fully pathetic. And again, I'm reminded, because of Fire and Blood, because of House of the Dragon, every time I see the name Viserys now, I think of the other Viserys.
Of course.
Which makes this current Viserys seem like even more of a pathetic whimper of the Targaryen strength.
I know, that comparison is so bleak.
But digging a little deeper, I wanted to play with these naming conventions, because we see the torch being passed here. There's no shot after this chapter and the last one put together that Viserys is ever going to sit on the Iron Throne. No one's thinking that. First read, 50th read of the books, it's completely out of the question. So the fact that he keeps calling himself the Dragon, even though his prospects are totally gone and he's the only one who doesn't know it, I wanted to play with that naming convention, because we've seen 2 seasons now of a whole HBO show full of Targaryens. And even the crazy ones with dragons never call themselves dragons.
That's true.
So what is that? I mean, I have some ideas to play with, but just to toss it to you, what is that about? Is that just symbolic because they're the only ones of the House of the Dragon? Is he just clinging to that heraldry as they're in exile? Or is there more than symbolism?
Well, I wonder if Viserys is the only one to do it. We don't ever get to see King Aerys on the page because he's dead by the time our story begins. But I wonder if that is a naming convention that was adopted later on in the Targaryen family tree in the timeline. Because as we remember, I mean, except for Dany's dragons, but we don't know that yet. The dragons have all died out. So I wonder if as the dragons died out, did the Targaryens start calling themselves the dragon? So, so that like the dragon lives on, because actual dragons are gone. So all we have left are the Targaryens. So I wonder if that's something they adopted as they became, more and more insecure about their lack of actual dragons.
But none of the other houses do this. Like before they find the litter of baby direwolves at the beginning of this book, there aren't direwolves running around Winterfell. They almost feel like these mythical beings where that they did exist at some point, but they're not common. They're not a presence in life. But no one calls Ned Stark the direwolf.
Yeah.
He doesn't call himself the wolf.
Sure. But other people have called him the wolf. We saw that in Arya's last chapter. She overheard like something about the lion. I mean, people do it. They call the Lannisters lions, even though lions exist and are real. The Baratheons have the stag. That's a real animal. I know what you're saying, but I mean, you're right. We haven't heard other people call the Targaryens dragons. But I think that's because the Targaryens have essentially been like vanquished, like they're gone, they have no power anymore, and or people don't respect the power that they had or still do have. And so I think that them calling themselves dragons feels like an overshot, like trying too hard to like make a name for yourself, like it's a little bit pathetic. But I wonder if it's not just Viserys,
because I feel like there's almost a qualifier on the other houses when they are called by that almost sigil, because you think of someone being called the Lion of Lannister.
Right.
And there's the Lannister part in there. Like when Dany refers to herself or Viserys as being the blood of the dragon, that kind of qualifier tracks with the way the other houses refer to themselves.
Yes.
But the fact that Viserys just calls himself the dragon, it does speak to some kind of, I don't know, extra level of delusion. Because
yes.
Right up until the end of the chapter, I was going to say Dany never calls herself the dragon.
Right.
But then, right at the end, she calls her unborn child the dragon, and even further, the true dragon.
Yes.
So there's something here, and we're tiptoeing into this weird through line for so much of genre fiction in the last 40 years that I just wanted to kind of flop on the table and play with. Because, I mean, this goes from Harry Potter with the pure blood thing to the importance of bloodlines in Star Wars or Dune or any of these. I don't know why it's such a big thing in franchise kind of genre fiction, but I feel like it does go beyond the symbolism into some real bloodline supremacy bullshit, which, I mean, I call it that because in normal life, people talking about the purity of bloodlines is always a bad sign.
It's a giant red flag, yeah.
That is always crazy supremacy, like bigot bullshit.
Right.
But here, in this world, like, it reminded me of House of the Dragon and some of the worst characters there. The Dragon Keepers, in the second to last episode of season 2 of House of the Dragon, talking about the blasphemy of having someone who's not of pure Targaryen blood trying to ride a dragon. I mean, that was that full-bore supremacy stuff. And Viserys calling the Dothraki savages reminded me of Jace calling the not pure blood Targaryens mongrels in that same episode. So there is this really ugly undercurrent where it's almost... It's not even dragon possession that's the thing that they're chafing at. It's about bloodlines.
Yes.
So do you think this is sort of posturing bigotry? Or in this world, like all these other fantasy and science fiction worlds, do bloodlines really have that much power here?
I think they do to the people in this world. I mean... on a divine level, because like if you want to talk about like specifically with the Targaryens and the dragons, like the dragons are compared to gods, or they're called gods, and the Targaryens by extension are compared to gods as well. Like they are divinely chosen to be able to ride these dragons. And we talked even in that House of the Dragon episode about how the dragons selecting their riders feels like this divinely ordained act. And so I think for them it is like so important and symbolic and like almost magical. I mean, even in our own history, I think a lot of these like genre fiction stories really cling to bloodlines because in our own Western history, that was really, really important. You think about the monarchy in England, the United Kingdom, like this idea of like it's through bloodlines specifically, and only pure bloodlines, like only children born of like ordained marriages by the church. And in England, at least, the sovereign is like an extension of God. Like they are ordained by God. They are chosen by God. Like there's a real religious through line and with the bloodline thing. So I think it's not just Viserys being a bigot. I think it is really essential to everybody in this world. I mean, even the Dothraki, who have a very different culture, we get a whole paragraph or two about the Bloodriders and about how even though they're not like connected by bloodlines, they become so, and they're called blood of my blood, and the Bloodriders die when the call dies. Like they're that connected to one another. So I think it's totally there.
I'm totally glad you took it there. I wanted to lay it out with that sort of discomfort layered in.
Yeah.
Because I always kind of clock that. It always makes me feel weird. But if you look at it, and yes, you're right, that especially the English history is where so much of this series is being pulled from.
Right.
And I think maybe you can interpret the discomfort we feel about these like magically endorsed bloodlines, because you're right. I mean, the dragons only accept people from a certain bloodline. We can interpret the discomfort that we feel about that maybe as part of the critique that's how we should feel about fucking monarchies.
Oh, yeah.
In any
100%.
sort of hereditary rule.
Yeah, like it's actually stupid and bullshit. And if you try to keep the blood pure, you get, freaky incest babies. Like it's actually not a good thing.
You get that entitlement. You get that insular rule and lack of perspective. And totally. Yeah, because I love making these massive engines of warfare and fear in the dragons. I like making them they're almost the guardrails on the bowling lane to keep these freaky monarchical rules in place.
Yes.
Because they will only accept riders of a certain bloodline and lineage. I'm glad we keep the discomfort of the monarchy in this like flyaway fantasy setting.
Me too. And what I think is really interesting about Dany specifically here is that she sort of, in her own way, tries to push against this. Not only here, but beyond. But here we see her, when she hits Viserys with the belt, it cuts his face open, and so he's bleeding. And we learned that it is forbidden in Vaes Dothrak, within the city, for anybody to carry a weapon and for anybody to spill the blood of a free man. And Dany breaks that rule. She spills Viserys's blood, and not only is she like breaking this sacred rule, she is spilling the like sacred Targaryen dragon blood. And so she's sort of pushing against
the blood of the dragon.
Exactly. And then we see her later on throughout her journey, even though she still like clings to this idea that she's divinely chosen because she's a Targaryen, we still see her trying to push against the order of things and like the social hierarchy by, being this like breaker of chains, freeing the slaves, right? We see her doing that sort of thing throughout a big chunk of her story. And so she's trying to push against like the norms and push against what has been like traditional and like, well, you don't have noble blood, so you don't get anything. She's trying to push against that in many ways. Not 100%, of course, because she still has to be on top. But you see her going in a different direction than anybody else has gone.
I love how fluid the dragons are and how many things they can come to represent just in these different chapters. Never mind all the ways we've toyed with them in House of the Dragon,
right,
in Fire and Blood. Because circling back to the original sort of question here, Viserys calling himself the dragons feel like a shorthand for that monarchical structure that he's trying to invoke, saying, it's my right. I'm the only Targaryen. I'm winning by default. What are you going to take, the girl? Like, that's been that was the plot of House of the Dragon. It's like, oh, we can't have women ascend to the...
Right, yeah.
So the dragon becomes a shorthand for just this shitty little entitled right to rule without doing anything for it. And no one who's even on his side believes in him. I love the way Jorah shit talks him throughout this chapter.
Me too, yeah.
So I like this. We're toying with the symbology of the dragon.
We are.
There's so much of that here. Even though there is action in this chapter, like the last few, there's maybe more subtext than there is text.
Yeah.
Once again, I have another thing to play with sort of on that track.
Okay, I also have a small thing about dragons and kings. I don't know.
Ooh, okay.
You want me to do that first?
Sure.
This was a side note I had. I didn't know where to put it. I think this is a good spot to put it. When Dany is walking through the British Museum, when Viserys calls it the like trash of broken cities or whatever.
Dead cities.
Thank you, dead cities. One thing that I noticed was that like maybe I should just read it to you, this little chunk, because it's really interesting.
I hope we didn't write down the same paragraph again.
Does it start with Beyond the Horse Gate?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Is it okay if I read it?
Oh, sure.
Okay. Beyond the Horse Gate, plundered gods and
Damn it.
stolen heroes.
Come on.
Do you want to read it?
No.
Okay. Beyond the Horse Gate, as I read this, pay attention to what the different monuments and statues are doing.
I am.
Okay. Beyond the Horse Gate, plundered gods and stolen heroes loomed to either side of them. The forgotten deities of dead cities brandished their broken thunderbolts at the sky as Dany rode her silver past their feet. Stone kings looked down on her from their thrones, their faces chipped and stained, even their names lost in the mists of time. Lithe young maidens danced on marble plinths, draped only in flowers, or poured air from shattered jars. Monsters stood in the grass beside the road. Black iron dragons with jewels for eyes, roaring griffins, manticores with their barbed tails poised to strike, and other beasts she could not name. Some of the statues were so lovely that they took her breath away, others so misshapen and terrible that Dany could scarcely bear to look at them. Those, Ser Jorah said, had likely come from the Shadowlands beyond Asshai. So what I noticed about this chapter, I'm very much looking forward to what you have to say. What I noticed about this paragraph, not chapter, sorry, was that the kings are the most decayed, the most decrepit, falling apart. But the monsters are the ones that are still standing, and they still have power over Dany. She can't even look at them.
Ain't that how it goes?
Right. And so I was trying to figure out what that might mean. Is it about how, like, kings don't last, but monsters do? Is it about dragons as monsters and them overtaking the kings? I don't think so, because we know the dragons have all died out. And even if we zoom ahead to season 8, Dany's dragons, I think, are all killed eventually. And so she also, like, is not, that doesn't work either. So maybe it's more about, like, Dany's eventual fate, where she becomes a monster instead of a king or a queen. Or maybe it's more symbolic and metaphorical. Maybe it's about the monsters who, like, you know, hide in the shadows around the king. I don't know what to make of that, but I thought it was interesting.
Survive. Cockroaches survive the nuclear apocalypse.
Yeah, it's something like that. I thought that was a really interesting thing to see. It wasn't like Dany looked up at these kings and she was, like, inspired by them. It's like she's noticing they're in decay, but the monsters are still what have power over her.
Yes. Yes.
So what did you make of that paragraph?
I'm glad you read out the whole paragraph, because I just pulled certain phrases from it. It's funny that we transitioned to the exact same paragraph.
Incredible. I was like, wait, I have a thing.
So
what if it was about me?
I'm big on phrases.
Yeah.
Just as a little peek behind the curtain there. Whenever I'm titling a story or a book or a comic or anything I've made, I love nothing more than the 2-word phrase. I just think it's the best titling structure.
Yeah.
So my brain is always tuned to 2-word phrases.
Cool.
And they started to jump off the page at me here. They're beautiful. They're tragic. I feel like the level of... I mean, he's almost writing in verse here. There's such an attention to wording. Not that he's ever sloppy, but you know what I mean. The caliber of writing in this paragraph is unbelievable.
I know. I think he writes the best when he's writing Dany. Like, I think he just leans in to his, like, fun writing style. Like, he gets really, I don't know, colorful and creative when he writes Dany. It's my favorite.
And it reminded me of an idea we talked about a couple Ned chapters ago about this sort of death of heroic fantasy, as we sort of ruin all of these mystical, beautiful, rose-tinted legends about Robert's rebellion when Robert's now this coward trying to kill a child halfway across the world.
Right.
So there is this disillusionment happening throughout the narrative. And these phrases, these 2-word phrases like plundered gods, stolen heroes, forgotten deities, dead cities, broken thunderbolts, stone kings, they're not quite oxymorons.
No, but almost.
But they are beautiful and tragic. There is that corrosive feeling in every single one.
Right.
And I realized what they are. Okay. They're not oxymorons. They're eulogies of decay.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you brought up those ruins of this city, kind of as a prelude before we get into the city proper. And the monsters that Dany can barely look at. This is where we transition into Targaryen Checkpoint phase. I'm instantly thinking, when Dany is looking away from these monstrous kind of remains or relics, I'm thinking about Sansa and Arya deciding whether or not they're going to watch their father be beheaded.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So it's omens. This chapter, this Targaryen checkpoint, I know we probably have a couple more Dany's before Ned has died, but if you look at Ned's prospects in the last 2 chapters, he's fucked already.
Oh,
right?
For sure.
The leg is broken.
It's not good.
He's basically arrested. He's trapped in
Yeah.
it's over.
It's
already
bad.
over. He's still alive. He's still breathing, but it's completely over. And I love that this heraldry, this symbolism, these omens that we're piling on as we head into the next phase of this book. We're already establishing Ned's death. And what that means, because when people talk about the death of Ned Stark in the show or the book, that is the shot heard round the world. That is the cannon blast, the calling card of this entire series. I don't think anyone's ever really moved past that in the first season.
No, how can you?
As a mission statement. And we've talked about this many times, but the death of Ned Stark is the moral death of Westeros.
Yeah.
And in these omens and this symbolism, as we build up to that, we're hyping up that breaking point. And it becomes a glimpse of this future. I mean, King's Landing is about to fall apart. The king is about to die. Ned is in shambles and all the wrong people are in charge. He's finding out the real hierarchy. Multiple hands get killed. The spy masters are actually in control. The Lannisters are slowly leeching power from the Baratheon king, who's just a figurehead, who's never at council meetings. Winterfell is in peril. Both parents are gone. Half the kids are gone. One of them fell off a roof.
Yeah,
They're
not good.
crying, holding hands the last time we saw them.
Yeah.
All the good places and important places of this world are in freefall. And I love that in this chapter, we don't just set up the freefall, but we look to the future. Because Dany's visiting these ruins. And that is possibly the ghost of Christmas future for King's Landing and Winterfell.
Oh,
they
of
could end up
course.
just
Yeah.
like Vaes Dothrak. That's absolutely
Yes.
on the menu. And that's where it really stuck out to me when we get this real-time eulogy from Viserys, and he refers to these relics and ruins and the British Museum here as the trash of dead cities.
Yeah.
Because if we refer back to some of those oxymoronic sort of eulogies of decay, plundered gods, stolen heroes, forgotten deities, dead cities, broken thunderbolts, stone kings, a little later in the chapter, there's another phrase that jumped out at me that felt like it crystallized this entire point. Civilized men.
Okay.
That's what we're losing. That is becoming as bitter and decayed and
I see.
oxymoronic as all of these other things.
I like that.
This is waving the white flag here. I think we are full steam ahead going off the cliff.
That's really interesting. I like that a lot. As you were talking talking about the monsters and the things that Danny's looking at, I just remembered Arya's chapter, the last chapter with Arya, where she was walking through the dragon skulls and she described them as monsters. And we talked about in these relics, we talked about that chapter as her sort of graduating from her nightmares and actually having to live through them and navigate them herself and not just passively experience them. But I think that little reminder there with Dany here, I guess just for me, it reminds me of how young Dany is. She's still a child. She's 13, 14. She's 14. She's older than Arya and is dealing with a lot more adult stuff than Arya is. But still, like, Dany is a child. And that is so sad. Like both Dany and Arya are deeply afraid of and impacted by these monsters that they're looking at, even though they both know that they can't hurt them. Like, they're just their skulls or their stone or whatever, but like they can't actually hurt them, but they're still afraid of them in this very childlike way. That makes me sad.
No, this is a perfect transition to what I wanted to play with, because you're right, Dany's going through so much shit right now, and she's smart, and she is a survivor. She's not a cockroach like we talked about before.
No.
And she won't survive, spoiler, she won't survive all of these events. So you could say there is a moral line somewhere, not counting the bells.
Sure.
But I want to play with sort of the contradictions within her evolution, because she's having to grow up and adapt to all of this horrible shit really fast, and I'm enjoying the contradictions within that evolution. The thing that really caught my attention, and I had to kind of write out my thoughts here to even make sense of this, was this long paragraph of narration where Dany is kind of spitballing the future for this unborn child. And she's imagining him on the throne. And she's thinking about the Kingsguard. And she still refers to the Kings... This is in her head, so it's not dialogue. But
right.
She describes the Kingsguard in her head as ever noble, valiant, and true. Mm-hmm. And this is in the same paragraph where she acknowledges, hey, one of the Kingsguards murked my dad.
Right, yeah.
But she still thinks of them as ever noble, valiant and true. And even beyond that, she's still gaming out a possibility of her son sitting on the Iron Throne. Is this some sort of heightened delusion? Is this like a childhood innocence, naivete? Is this because Viserys has been drumming this plan into her head for her whole life?
Right.
What do you make of that?
Well, yeah. I mean, well, first, I think I seem to remember when she's using those words, like ever, true, and what was the other
Ever
words?
noble, valiant, and true.
See, I think that was her saying the songs always describe the Kingsguard as that. And she's sort of coming to terms with the reality that they're not always like that, because you have somebody like the Kingslayer, you have Barristan Selmy, who defected and went over to Robert's side. But what she's really thinking about here is Bloodriders and how they are like even better versions of the Kingsguard. So I think she is like simultaneously becoming less naive and learning about the harsh truths of the world, but still clinging on to that initial dream of my child being on the throne. I've had this idea drilled into my head forever that I am like my brother is the rightful heir, but we are the rightful monarchs of Westeros. And I can imagine that I bet Viserys would probably eventually want to marry Dany and have children with her to keep the bloodline pure. So like her kid would still be on the throne. So she's sort of like adapting with like the new knowledge that she has. Like actually the Bloodriders would work a lot better here, but still experiencing that like she can't imagine a different possibility than her and her child or her child being on the throne. I think that's sort of where she still is.
I love that observation of her recognizing these analogs across cultures, because even if say you take the cynical approach, your dad's murdered by one of his, Secret Service detail.
basically, yeah.
That would make you incredibly jaded towards any sort of security details, and you wouldn't believe they'd ever stay loyal.
And you wouldn't trust anybody ever. Like, you'd be so isolated and alone.
But she's seeing this idea emerge in a different culture with the Bloodriders, even more loyal. So that's what caught me, because I don't think she's being naive.
No, I don't think so. Especially because she doesn't look at the Bloodriders in like a romanticized, naive way.
No.
She admits that each of the three of them, like there are three that Khal Drogo has. And she admits that one of them she likes okay, but two of them like genuinely scare her. And like we have evidence that they are very like not cool and are abusive to her handmaidens, and like that they are scary dudes that she doesn't like love and trust with like this familial energy, but she still trusts that they will do what they say they're going to do, which is protect Khal Drogo and ride with him always and die when he dies. And so she, I think, doesn't have these like grand ideas of these noble, pure knights being at her side,
right? But
she still like says, well, she thinks about the core idea of the Bloodrider. I'm on board with that, and I want that for me and my son.
Yes, and past all of those temperament issues and behavioral atrocities, there is that, like you're saying, there is this prevalent loyalty to the leader,
right?
Like, it's strange because her head is not in the clouds here. She's not a naive idealist. The conversation with Viserys and eventually the fight with Viserys represents a pretty brutal, clear-eyed pragmatism. The way she shames and dismisses him and kind of corrects him on where he stands in this Khalasar, that shows us that she understands the hierarchy better than Ned Stark does in the Capitol. She understands what's going on here, but she still does have a little bit of this idealism with the Kingsguard and, by extension, the Bloodriders. And I was almost recognizing this level of idealism. You called it a dream earlier with her child eventually sitting the Iron Throne. It feels like the inverse of the problem of evil poisoned characters we've been talking about lately. In the last two chapters alone, I'm thinking of Lysa Arryn and Jaime Lannister. And Dany has been exposed to more problem of evil provocations in this book than anyone. Especially at 14. So I'm not at all saying that she's naive. She's been, even just in the years with Viserys before the joys of joining the Khalasar, she's raised by wolves, and she survived Viserys, where most people probably wouldn't. And if you remember, she saw through Illyrio almost immediately.
She sure did.
Almost immediately. So I love her ongoing development.
Me
I love
too.
that she's undergoing this harsh education and gaming out some of these contradictions in character, because I do think this character, underneath it all, even right up until the end, has this optimism and idealism. She has this dream, and it never feels as tyrannical and self-serving as all the other Targaryens we've gotten to know in the series.
I agree. Yeah, like she has the right temperament to be like adamant about pursuing what she wants, but she's not quite on the same level of it being, yes, so self-serving. I think a big part of that, the reason that she feels so like separate, not only from the Targaryens, but from everybody else around her who would be poisoned by the problem of evil, is like this feeling of isolation that she has. Another thing I noticed in this chapter, which is similar to the last Catelyn chapter we talked about, is this personification of landscape and monuments. We saw that a lot in Catelyn's chapter as she went, journeyed up to the Eyrie, going up the mountains and stuff, how we took like almost a Tolkienian journey up this mountain. And here, it doesn't feel Tolkienian necessarily, mostly because we're in this very non-Tolkien, like non-Middle-earth like land, but also like it's not as romantic and sweeping, but we still get a lot of active, like human verbs that the monuments and landscape are doing. We get verbs like loomed, and a lot of those are in that paragraph we read, but they're beyond it as well. But we get like loomed, brandished, danced, poured, sprawled, roaring, poised to strike, admit and keep out, standing. So we get a lot of these like active verbs that the landscape is doing. And what we saw that tool accomplishing in Catelyn's chapter was that it heightened and emphasized her isolation. Catelyn is isolated from the world. She's isolated from the people around her. We also talked about how it emphasized Lysa's isolation, like literally, but also figuratively. That's a new word that I've just invented. But I think it's happening with Dany too. It's like we're reminded of that tool. We think about isolation, and Dany is feeling overwhelmed by all of this unfamiliar stuff around her. But even so, it's not exactly the same as with Catelyn. Like Dany is not totally isolated. Like she is trying to assimilate. She's, unfamiliar with this new city, but she's trying to be open-minded to it. She even like says to Viserys, like, you're talking about the Dothraki, those are my people. I'm part of the Dothraki now. Like I'm a Khaleesi now. Like she's trying to assimilate and even get Viserys to do so too, but by getting him Dothraki clothes and like trying to get him to, be part of the group and trying to get him to ride up ahead with her and call Drogo. But it's still not working because the whole thing with Viserys backfires. She ends this chapter alone and sad and dreaming of home, which of course suggests that where she is now is not where she feels at home. What I did like about that is we don't actually see, like we don't know which home she's dreaming of. Is she dreaming of the house with the red door? Is she dreaming of Westeros? Is she dreaming of Dragonstone? Like where specifically is she dreaming of? And I kind of think she doesn't know. I think she's just dreaming of the idea of home. She
doesn't have a concrete home. And
right.
She's talked about that before, where she almost has this phantom limb for how she feels towards King's Landing, where she knows it's her ancestral home that she was like spirited away from. So there's
I don't think she's actually ever been there.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. But she still considers that where she should be.
Yes.
And I mean, she moves so much throughout these 5 books or 8 seasons. And I don't think she ever really settles in anywhere.
No, she doesn't.
I think that's part of why she turns so hard when she gets to King's Landing.
Probably.
Because when the rubber hits the road there and you finally, live the dream and it's shit, that becomes sort of a breaking point.
Yes, right. But before she gets to that, you're right. Like what you said earlier, like she has this idealism because she's had to do things on her own. She doesn't have anybody she can fully trust and or who fully understands her and her experience and what she wants. And so she is trying to navigate and fit in where she can and find people to trust, at least temporarily, people like Jorah, people like Missandei, right? Like clinging on to people in that way, but still like being fully like self-sufficient and in charge of what she wants and what she's trying to do, kind of clinging on to that almost naive idea, that like dream that she's had embedded in her brain since she was born,
And that I can never stop picturing her on Drogon in the bells. And with the context of this chapter, going back to what you talked about, the relics, I feel like that's the moment where she's forced to make eye contact with the monster.
Yeah.
And that's where she turns and breaks bad.
I like that. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
And interesting that this thing that she's clinging to is her dragons and her dragon eggs. Like that's what makes her feel stronger. I think that's the most the deepest connection she has with anybody in her entire life, I think, is her dragons. And I think that's sort of, again, that's the almost like naive hope that she has. Like the dragons are her hope, and that's what gives her strength. So that's what she clings to the most.
Yes.
And that's what's with her the whole way through.
Very ominous, very dark, very doomed. I'm excited for this next batch of chapters now that we've laid the framework with this Targaryen checkpoint. Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to know how many more Dany chapters we have in the book. I like this sort of a la carte rolling theory type approach to our analysis. So.
I think we're probably going to have to, I mean, a lot still has to happen with her, though.
I know. We got to kill Khal Drogo. She's got to give...
he has to get sick, and then he has to die, and then she has to, like, and then, well, they got to kill Viserys at some point. She has to have her baby. Like, a lot of stuff has to happen. So... yeah, I'm not sure how that's going to go, but it's exciting. It's exciting. Cool.
Excellent.
Well, and of course, the next chapter is a Bran chapter. He is also a fantastic framing device for segments of the book. Gives us some, little prophecy flavors here and there.
Dreams and omens and birds and nature.
Can't wait to dive right into that. So anyway, it's going to be a lot of fun.
And of course, if you want even more George R. R. Martin related discussions from us over on Patreon, like we discussed, is our Fire and Blood series. We're 11 volumes deep. We're currently hacking away at volume 12, which is going to conclude that series and cover basically the first half of the book, everything that happens before the events of House of the Dragon begin. So there's a lot of stuff to jump into over there. And of course, we've done so much fantasy over the years. We've gone chapter by chapter through all of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, through all of the Witcher books, and now we're working through Game of Thrones. So if you love fantasy, you're in the right place. We also do horror. We talk about all sorts of shit all the time. The episodes never end, and thank you very much for joining us, for listening, and we'll be back on Tuesday or Sunday, depending on if there's a bonus episode, with a brand new episode.
Bye.